the skinniest version of Mario is back for another adventure with Paper Mario Color Splash. As the title suggests, this is certainly a very colourful journey, but is it vibrant all the way through, or does it eventually wash out? If it wasn't already obvious, Paper Mario Color Splash is a game featuring the paper cutout versions of Mario and his ilk. In this particular outing, it seems someone has sent Princess Peach a letter that turns out to be a color-drained and folded-up citizen, or Toad, from the island nation of Port Prisma. Isn't that nice? Actually, Princess Peach finds this rather troubling, so she and one of her Toad servants enlist Mario's services as they all head to Port Prisma to figure out who could have sent that Toad and how they drained his color. Unfortunately, it seems Port Prisma isn't quite the island paradise it used to be anymore. You see, upon reaching the island, Peach, Mario and Toad finds that the town is seemingly abandoned and that several areas have lost their usual vibrant colors. It also seems the apparently famous Prisma fountain has been damaged and or drained, as Mario activates some sort of emergency recovery unit to try and restore it. Of course, the fountain won't be restored quite so easily, as this recovery unit only seems to consist of a single paint can. This is no ordinary paint can though, as it turns out to be a sentient being named Huey. He reveals that the fountain is actually supposed to have 6 big paint stars that somehow must have been stolen by somebody. Before they can do much about this though, Toad is suddenly attacked and drained by a so-called Shy Guy. Luckily, Huey knows how to fix him, as he grants Mario the ability to use his hammer to bring back color to any and all colorless spots in this world. Okay, so going around smashing things with a hammer seems like a pretty weird way to paint stuff, but whatever, it does the trick. This all sets off an adventure that sends Mario and Huey all over this world to repaint the drained spots and reclaim the big and small paint stars. There are a few other developments as well, like the discovery of who the villain is and such, but then you should be able to figure out who's behind all of this if you've ever played any Mario game before. Hint, it's not Luigi. As for the gameplay, that's pretty standard fare to those already familiar with the Paper Mario games. Basically, you travel around collecting various items and battling all kinds of critters, while occasionally fighting some bosses and indulging in a few minigame type things. All of this is fairly stock at this point, but some things are handled a bit differently than expected. Take leveling up, for example. In the past, you leveled up your various stats by getting experience points in battle. You know, just like every other RPG ever. In this game though, you only occasionally level up your health and or the maximum amount of paint your hammer can carry, as those are the only stats you actually have. Yeah, I've been a bit absent from this franchise for a while, so I don't know exactly when this shift happened, but at some point, Paper Mario went from an RPG to more of an adventure game. You don't even have any sort of equipment or stats to worry about anymore, and yet they still try to keep a few RPG elements for absolutely no apparent reason. Honestly, they don't add anything at all. Now, I don't necessarily mind all that much that this is no longer an RPG, but since they're not willing to go full hog with the change, certain things just end up feeling out of place or completely mishandled. This is most notable when it comes to the battle system, which, don't get me wrong, does work, but it just feels a bit unnecessary and honestly, kind of stupid. First of all, these battles may not be random, but enemies still pop up all the time, meaning you'll deal with them quite a lot. As such, they can become kind of an annoyance, especially when you realize that they have little to no purpose whatsoever. Okay, so you can get some extra paint from them and all, but as you don't need or get EXP anymore, most battles are fairly useless. Second of all, the battles themselves are mind-bogglingly weird. No, I don't mind that they're turn-based, especially since they still keep the whole thing where you can defend yourself or cause extra damage by pressing a button at the right time, but I do mind the fact that the whole thing is now based around fucking cards. Yeah, I believe they did something like this with the previous game as well, but I don't think it was to this extent. Here, every battle is determined by your so-called battle cards. You have no other input, it's all about which cards you have available. Oh, this can and usually does work, I guess, but if you can't already spot the potential problems here, allow me to enlighten you. First, there's the issue of having the necessary cards. Most of the time not an issue, as most enemies can be dealt with in several ways, but other times, big fucking problem. Some enemies can only be taken down with certain types of attacks, meaning you have to have specific cards in your deck or you're screwed. Sure, you can usually flee if necessary, but still, not exactly an ideal situation. Secondly, there's the plain and simple issue of just having any cards at all. Yeah, it's not like these cards reshuffle or anything, they can only be used once and then they're gone. Oh, it's not exactly difficult to get new cards as they fall out of enemies' arses all the time, and you can even buy them with the coins you collect, but there are times when you'll most likely run very low anyway. Again, these cards do work without issues most of the time, but this just isn't anywhere near as good or reliable a system as a command-based one. Seriously, it would be one thing to use cards for certain special moves or something, but using them for everything is just ridiculous. It also forces you to constantly go back and forth to restock, so all in all, this system just doesn't make sense. Thankfully, there are some other elements to this game as well. There's the relatively obvious platforming, but there's also some slight puzzle solving once in a while. Actually, these two elements even kinda intersect sometimes, as you'll occasionally have to utilize the new cutout technique. Now, I apologize for not really being able to showcase this or a few other elements properly, but the thing is that this game utilizes the Wii U Gamepad for quite a few of its features. For example, you choose and play your battle cards on it, and you also use it for all game settings and such. More importantly though, the Gamepad is also where you'll really be experiencing the cutout technique. You see, at certain points you'll come across a seemingly insurmountable gap, but something in the background still lines up to create a path to the other side. If you press the Y button at the right spot, a dotted cutout line will appear on the gamepad, and if you trace it, Mario will jump into the cutout section and traverse the gap, returning to the TV screen when he reaches the opposite side. This same technique is also utilized when certain cards are needed to make some sort of event happen in the world itself. For example, you may need to place a giant fan behind a ship to put some wind in its sails. This is all well and good, although it does feel a bit gimmicky and somewhat like an excuse to give the gamepad something to do. In addition to that, you can occasionally also take part in several 3-round Rochambeau tournaments. That's right, you'll eventually get the chance to play rock, paper, scissors against various opponents, and while this isn't really all that challenging, it's a very good way to grind for money and a good way to prevent the game from becoming too monotonous. Now, I mentioned earlier that a big part of the game is to recolor all the colorless spots found throughout it, but I didn't really explain how this works. You see, every level of the game will have several patches that have been drained of color. Restoring color to these spots will usually yield some coins or something, and it also increases the level's restoration percentage. In addition to that though, there are certain colorless spots that work slightly differently. Some are actually toads that will basically help move the story along and or help you out in some way, and there are also spots that restore some sort of function to the level. For example, restoring color to a drained waterfall will restore water to the nearby lake as well. There are also spots that can only be restored by recovering the big paint stars, meaning there are several levels you'll have to come back to sometimes several times if you want to recolor everything. All of this is surprisingly enjoyable, and although some spots can be a bit hard to find as they're really small or well hidden, there's still something very satisfying about fully restoring a level. Maybe that has something to do with the game's visuals, which are very, very good. As you should have noticed by now, everything looks like it's made out of either paper or cardboard, and when I say that, I do mean that it really looks like the real thing, at least at times. The whole color focus also makes this game really leap out of the screen, and it's just very, very pleasing to the eyes. It's also very easy on the ears, as the music is very pleasant indeed. No, I don't think I would call it anything all that remarkable really, but it does put me in a very good mood most of the time, and I've rarely enjoyed a title screen as much as I enjoyed the one for this game. Most of the sound effects are also flawless, so the game's audio can certainly lighten your mood. Ultimately, that's what this game excels at, putting you in a good mood. It's just so charming and endearing, with just the right amount of cheesy yet enjoyable humor and gags that it keeps you wanting more. Yes, there are some admittedly minor issues with certain gameplay elements, and it might be slightly repetitive at times, but I definitely enjoyed my time with the game. With some of the crispest visuals available, a soundtrack that melts in your ears, and enough charm to fill even the crustiest of hearts, Paper Mario Color Splash manages to put such a big smile on your face that it more than makes up for a few shortcomings in the gameplay. Some more traditional RPG elements wouldn't have hurt, but overall, it still gets my highest recommendations.